54 years ago, a 9-month-old baby boy vanished from a quiet neighborhood in Arizona, disappearing without a trace, leaving his family shattered and living in anguish for decades. Authorities quickly launched a search, but faced with an empty scene, no body, no signs of violence, and very few leads to pursue, the investigation eventually stalled and was filed away as a cold case. However, throughout those 54 years, the victim's family never gave up hope, clinging to the slim possibility that the child was still alive somewhere. Then one day, more than half a century after the disappearance, when a grown man began questioning his own identity over tiny details in his life, he uncovered a crucial connection that everyone had overlooked, a connection that would upend the entire case in a way no one could have imagined. Before we dive into this shocking story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you love cold cases solved after decades of silence, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next video. In 1965, Arizona was in a period of quiet but optimistic transformation, as Phoenix rapidly expanded with new neighborhoods, young families flocking to settle there, carrying a strong belief that this was a safe place to build a future. The social atmosphere at the time was enveloped in a sense of mutual trust. Neighbors knew each other by face, children were considered safe, even when out of sight for short periods, and the idea of organized crime or child abductions was still foreign to most people. In that context, the Williams family was a typical example of the young middle class in Phoenix. The father had a stable job. The mother devoted most of her time to caring for the family. Their life revolved around regular routines, with no conflicts, no secrets, and no signs that they would soon become the center of a tragedy spanning decades. Robert Williams, their 9-month-old son, was the absolute focus of the family, a child too young to protect himself, completely dependent on adults for everything, and his presence brought a clear sense of bonding among the members. The person most directly and regularly involved with Robert in daily activities was the main witness in the case, someone close and familiar with every little habit of the baby, responsible for watching and caring for him in normal routines, and who had never had any serious incidents before. The day of the incident started like any other, with routine activities showing nothing unusual, tasks proceeding in the familiar rhythm, no one in the family having any premonition or vague worry about danger, and that very normalcy significantly lowered the level of alertness to small anomalies. During those activities, a strange element began to appear, not clear enough to immediately raise alarm, but enough to create a deviation from the daily routine. A stranger appeared in the familiar living space, with a friendly demeanor, normal conversation, no threatening appearance, causing the main witness to feel only a fleeting vague suspicion before quickly reassuring themselves that it was unnecessary worry. This psychological reaction, the fluctuation between suspicion and trust, between vigilance and the community's habit of trusting others at that time, meant that initial danger signals were not properly recognized, though in hindsight, they carried all the characteristics of a risky situation. The moment Robert was no longer under control happened quickly and silently, no cries, no signs of struggle, no clear action to mark the boundary between safety and disaster, just a short period when attention was diverted, enough to turn a 9-month-old child into a missing person. When Robert's absence was noticed, the initial reaction was not panic, but denial, an effort to reassure themselves that he had just been carried elsewhere, or was somewhere very close, and this psychological reflex delayed those critical minutes before emergency action was taken. The family began a spontaneous search in the surrounding area, calling Robert's name, checking every familiar space, every small corner they could think of, while the main witness tried to piece together fragmented images in their memory. But the details became blurry and uncertain under increasing psychological pressure. Panic only truly erupted when all reasonable possibilities were ruled out, when the search yielded no sign that Robert was still nearby, and a feeling of complete loss of control began to envelop the family. In those first hours, emotions shifted rapidly from hope to fear, from efforts to stay calm to the realization that this was no longer an ordinary mishap, and the decision to call the police was made as a last step in the family's chain of hopeless reactions. marking the moment Robert Williams was officially reported missing, and the seemingly solid peace of an Arizona family, in 1965, was shattered forever. The missing person call was received while the family was still in panic, information conveyed not in a clear order, but fragmented and overlapping, accurately reflecting the psychological state of those who had just realized their 9-month-old child had vanished from their control. The case was handled according to the standard procedures of the Phoenix Police in 1965, when child disappearances were not yet treated as a distinct crime category, but often intermixed with other civil matters, and priority depended heavily on the initial assessment by the desk officer. Recorded information included the victim's age, the last time seen, the location of the incident, and the identity of the direct caregiver. But even at this stage, gaps emerged due to timelines not being absolutely precise, partly because the witness's memory was still chaotic, partly because no one thought every passing minute could be life or death. The investigation was activated almost immediately after the call ended, but at a level appropriate for a case classified as a child possibly wandering off rather than a clear abduction, since there were no signs of break-in, no cries for help, no evidence of violence at the initial time. In the first hours, the classification decision played a key role, as investigators had to weigh the possibility of the child being taken by a stranger against the chance the baby had temporarily left the familiar area, while adults were distracted, and the very lack of clear crime indicators made the initial approach more cautious than absolutely urgent. Nevertheless, nearby patrol units were dispatched to conduct an initial search perimeter, focusing on public spaces, walkways, neighboring residential areas, and locations where a child of this age could be taken in a short time. This perimeter was based mainly on a reasonable travel radius in the estimated time since Robert vanished, but the uncertainty about the exact last seen time made the search area both too broad to control effectively and too narrow to ensure no important possibilities were missed. Parallel to the field search, investigators began collecting information and initial statements from the family and those present near the time of the incident, trying to reconstruct the context before and during the moment Robert disappeared. But these statements were highly emotional, influenced by psychological shock and mounting fear hour by hour. The main witness, who directly supervised Robert, was asked to describe the entire sequence, from daily activities to the appearance of the unusual element. But memory at this point did not operate in a linear logic, but kept circling around a few standout details, while others became blurry, posing a major challenge for investigators in determining key information versus post-event speculation. Details about the stranger, if any, were noted but not specific enough for immediate tracing. No clear description of appearance, no name, no identified vehicle, and no independent witnesses confirming that suspicious presence at the same time. Time pressure became evident as the clock passed the first hours since Robert was reported missing, because investigators knew that for a 9-month-old, every passing hour reduced the chances of finding him safely, while every investigative decision relied on incomplete information and unverified assumptions. The family continually provided new details as memories returned in fragmented pieces, which both helped expand the investigative picture and added noise when some information contradicted prior recordings, forcing police to constantly adjust their approach while trying to maintain necessary logical order. Throughout the first 48 hours, the investigation pace was maintained at a high level, combining field searches, statement collection, and screening key locations, but the absence of modern technology support meant everything depended heavily on human observation, memory, and subjective judgments. A sense of urgency spread not only within the investigative force, but also in the family and surrounding community, as every minute without concrete results raised fears that time was on the side of whoever had taken Robert from his familiar life. In that context, investigators had to continually balance expanding the search to cover all possibilities and focusing resources on the most feasible leads, while the family, caught in a whirlwind of waiting and fragile hope, gradually realized this had gone beyond an ordinary mishap, and was turning into a real race against time, where every decision in the first 48 hours could shape the entire future search process. When urgent search activities yielded no clear results in the first hours, the investigation's focus had to shift to reconstructing the most accurate possible timeline of what happened before, during, and immediately after Robert vanished, as this was the only foundation for determining the next direction with any basis. This work began with trying to pinpoint the last time Robert was definitively seen, a task that seemed simple but quickly revealed many difficulties, due to inconsistent initial statements, heavily influenced by panicked psychological states. The main witness was asked to repeat the sequence of events that day multiple times, each with a different approach, to strip away emotion and focus on specific details, like time, location, actions, and people present. But the results showed memory was not a seamless flow but a collection of fragmented pieces, some recalled vividly, while others were completely hazy. Investigators had to repeatedly ask clarifying questions about where Robert was placed, who was directly supervising in each interval, and whether there was any interruption in that supervision chain, because even a short gap could create conditions for taking a 9-month-old out of the area unnoticed. Parallel to the main witness's statement, investigators began cross-referencing information from others present or passing through the area in the relevant time frame, from family members to neighbors and acquaintances, with the goal of finding overlapping points to reinforce or refute each proposed timeline marker. This cross-referencing quickly exposed significant differences in statements, not in major details but in seemingly minor factors, like the order of actions, duration of activities, or time gaps between events, and these differences made determining the last seen moment far more complicated than initially anticipated. Some witnesses claimed to have seen Robert at a later time than the main witness's statement, while others recalled the baby had been absent for a longer period, creating two parallel timelines that couldn't both be true, forcing investigators to consider that one or more statements might be distorted by shock-affected memory. When the timeline markers were placed on a common axis for comparison, gaps began to appear clearly, especially short periods where no one could confirm directly seeing or interacting with Robert, and these gaps became critical in the analysis. A gap of just a few minutes might mean little in normal conditions, but in a 9-month-old's disappearance, it opened the possibility that removing Robert occurred in a window short enough to go unnoticed, especially if done by someone not perceived as threatening. Investigators tried to narrow these gaps by reconstructing every small activity that day, from changing Robert's position, daily routines, to random interactions with others, but each reconstruction only highlighted the reality that no one could provide an absolutely certain timestamp. Inconsistencies in initial information appeared not only between different witnesses, but even within the same person's statements when questioned at different times, a common phenomenon in trauma-involved cases, but one posing serious challenges to the investigation. A detail emphasized in the first statement might be downplayed or altered in later ones, not due to intentional concealment, but because the brain tends to restructure memories to fit current emotions, making investigators cautious in distinguishing objective truth from adjusted recollection. Reconstructing the timeline was thus not just a logical puzzle, but a complex psychological process, where investigators had to maintain necessary professional distance while handling the fragility of those providing information, as excessive pressure could distort memories further. When different timestamps were compared and ranked by reliability, a key period emerged as common to most statements: the final interval, when Robert was confirmed present before no one could affirm his presence, and though this marker remained approximate, it became the temporary basis for further analysis. However, even this timestamp wasn't fully solid, as small discrepancies persisted and couldn't be eliminated entirely, leaving an error margin large enough to make precisely pinpointing when Robert was taken impossible at this stage. Investigators realized that the contradictions and gaps in the timeline were not just obstacles but indirect clues, reflecting a situation where removing a child from the familiar environment happened discreetly enough to not be clearly remembered, and quickly enough to avoid a collective shocking moment. The result of this timeline reconstruction phase was not a complete and absolutely accurate sequence, but a relative time frame containing many questionable points and unfilled gaps, forcing the investigative team to accept that what happened in that critical window might never be fully recreated based solely on statements, and that every subsequent step would have to build on this foundation of uncertainty. From the relatively reconstructed timeline filled with many gaps and unresolved contradictions, the investigation team returned to the scene with the goal of systematically evaluating what actually existed in the space where Robert was last seen. But from the very beginning, they faced an unfavorable reality. This was not a crime scene in the traditional sense of a criminal case. There were no clear boundaries between the location of the incident and the surrounding living spaces, no signs indicating that an act of violence had taken place, and no specific point that could be definitively identified as the origin of the crime. The scene resembled everyday life more than a violated space, with items in their familiar positions, order undisturbed, and no details that would force an observer to conclude that a coercive incident had occurred. It was precisely this normality that made assessing the scene difficult, as it provided no obvious visual cues typically used to determine the criminal nature of an incident, and all inferences had to rely more on what was absent than on what was visible. During the search, the investigators found no physical evidence that could be directly linked to criminal activity, no signs of a struggle, no damaged objects, no footprints or unusual traces that could help trace back the path of the person who took Robert out of the area. The items associated with the child's daily life remained in place, showing no signs of being hastily gathered or left behind after a conflict, and the absence of such signs made the possibility of a violent abduction at the scene hard to prove in the initial assessment phase. The lack of physical evidence not only limited the ability to reconstruct specific events, but also directly affected how the case was classified, because in the context of 1965, activating in-depth investigative resources was often tied to the presence of clear criminal indicators. The investigators were forced to confront the core question of whether this was a criminal case from the start, or simply a missing child in undetermined circumstances, and the answer to this question would determine the entire direction of the investigation. When examining the possibilities, the absence of direct signs of violence became a key factor, as it made the hypothesis that Robert was snatched from his caregiver or coerced on the spot less convincing compared to the scenario of the child being taken away quietly, without drawing attention and without leaving traces. This aligned with what was reflected in the initial statements, where no one heard cries, no one witnessed a tense situation, and there were no indications that the event unfolded suddenly or chaotically. On that basis, a significant decision was made in this phase, not to handle the case as a full criminal investigation, at least in terms of the emergency measures typically applied to cases with clear criminal evidence. This decision did not stem from downplaying the case, but from the investigative logic of the time, when limited resources forced police to prioritize based on immediate danger and effective intervention potential, and in this instance, the lack of violent signs shifted the approach toward searching and verification rather than sealing off and pursuing suspects. The direct consequence of this decision was that the scene was not preserved at the highest level, no boundaries were established to prevent access by unauthorized people, and no evidence collection was conducted under strict criminal case standards, simply because there were no clear traces to collect. This meant that if more subtle signs had existed at the moment Robert disappeared, they could have been erased over time and through normal daily activities, without anyone recognizing their potential value in the first hours. The decision not to treat this as a criminal scene also affected how witnesses were interacted with, as interviews focused more on gathering descriptive information and reconstructing context rather than seeking signs of criminal intent, inadvertently reducing the ability to uncover details that might point to deliberate planning. In that context, the scene assessment became a process of elimination rather than confirmation, as investigators successively ruled out less likely scenarios based on what was not found, but could not strongly support any hypothesis due to the lack of specific data. The deeper consequences of this decision only gradually emerged over time, as not treating the scene as a crime space from the outset lost the only opportunity to collect potential physical clues in the very short window after the event, especially in a case involving an infant, where all traces are fragile and easily erased. When the investigators looked back at what had been done and not done during the scene assessment phase, they faced a clear paradox. The very absence of violent signs led to the case being handled less aggressively, yet that same absence aligned with the scenario of a child being taken quietly by someone who posed no threat, leaving a nearly intact scene. At the time of the investigation, this decision was still considered reasonable based on the available information, but it simultaneously set a clear limit on the potential for further progress in the scene assessment, as from that point onward, all investigative efforts had to rely primarily on statements, reasoning, and hypotheses rather than verifiable physical evidence, and this limitation began shaping a challenging investigative path from the very first steps. From the scene assessments revealing a complete absence of physical evidence and direct signs of violence, the investigation moved into a phase that had to rely mainly on logical analysis and hypothesis elimination, where each possibility was weighed not to find a quick answer, but to determine the approach with the fewest contradictions to what had been recorded. The first hypothesis seriously considered was the possibility of an accident or wandering off, as in many cases involving young children, especially in the family and community context of the 1960s, this was the most common scenario and the least criminal. However, when this hypothesis was compared to the specific facts of the case, inconsistencies quickly became apparent. Robert was only 9 months old, lacking the ability to move far enough on his own to leave the safe area without being noticed by adults, and all surrounding spaces where the boy was last seen had been thoroughly searched in the initial hours without any sign that he had crawled or slipped out of supervision. The investigators also considered the possibility that Robert suffered a sudden medical emergency, leading to him being rushed for treatment, while family members failed to notice in time, but this hypothesis was quickly ruled out when no medical facility in the area recorded admitting an infant in the relevant time frame, and no witnesses confirmed seeing an emergency serious enough to require immediate action. As the accident or wandering possibilities were gradually eliminated, the next focus shifted to the chance that Robert was taken by a familiar person or family member, a scenario often examined in child disappearances, since access and opportunity typically lie with those closest. The family background review was conducted cautiously, not only to avoid missing possibilities, but also to ensure every assumption was verified with concrete data, and the results showed no signs of serious internal conflict, no custody disputes, and no clear motive that could explain a family member taking Robert in such a short window without leaving traces or drawing significant attention. The investigators also weighed the possibility that an acquaintance outside the family exploited trust to remove Robert from the area, but the lack of complex social ties or suspicious prior interactions made this scenario hard to sustain as a central hypothesis. The process of eliminating unfit hypotheses ran parallel to re-examining known social context and daily habits of the era, as how people interacted with public spaces and strangers in 1965 differed markedly from modern safety standards, forcing investigators to think within the mindset of that period, rather than applying present-day assumptions. As random or internal possibilities narrowed, the abduction hypothesis emerged as the most encompassing analytical direction, though still lacking key elements for certainty. This hypothesis was not formed from specific evidence, but from the accumulation of things unexplained by other scenarios, particularly Robert's complete disappearance in a very short time, without disturbance, and without immediate reaction from those around. The abduction scenario fit a deliberate act carried out by someone calm enough not to draw attention, familiar enough with the environment to move naturally in the living space, and perceptive enough to exploit brief lapses in adult supervision. Once raised, the analysis focus shifted to evaluating possible motives, not to conclude prematurely, but to assess the plausibility of each scenario in the case's specific context. Financial motive was considered first but quickly dismissed. No ransom demand, no contact from any individual or group, and no signs the act aimed at direct pressure or profit from the family. Revenge or intentional harm to the family was analyzed but lacked grounding, with no hostile relationships, personal disputes, or social conflicts strong enough to lead to such an extreme act. This forced investigators to broaden consideration to less obvious motives, where abduction stemmed not from immediate material gain, but from personal needs, or the perpetrator's psychological state, a direction still novel and not clearly systematized at the time. Evaluating these motives faced many challenges due to lack of comparative data, no specific suspect to check history, behavior, or connections, with all reasoning based on general patterns drawn from scattered other cases. In that context, the abduction hypothesis existed as an open analytical framework, broad enough to cover what happened, but vague enough not to lead directly to immediate concrete action. The investigators understood that forming hypotheses did not mean getting closer to the final answer, but was a necessary step to restructure thinking in a case lacking clear leads. At this stage, all hypotheses remain provisional, ready for adjustment or elimination with new information, but the abduction hypothesis gradually gained prominence, not because it was convincingly proven, but because it was the only remaining scenario that could logically explain a 9-month-old child vanishing completely from a familiar environment without traces, while reflecting the level of calculation and discretion the act required. From the abduction hypothesis established as the most reasonable analytical framework, amid the absence of physical evidence, the investigation entered the phase of screening people, shifting focus from explaining what happened to identifying who might have done it, and how. The first group examined was individuals present in or around the family's living space at the time Robert disappeared, as access and opportunity were seen as critical in a case where removing a child occurred quickly and discreetly. This list included frequent visitors, nearby neighbors, people with legitimate reasons to appear without raising suspicion, and individuals vaguely mentioned by key witnesses in initial statements. Each person in this group was considered not with an assumption of guilt, but to assess how well their behavior, relationships, and timing aligned with the identified timeline gaps. Background and connection checks were conducted using the manual methods typical of the era, relying on existing records, supplemental statements, and cross-verification from those around, but the process soon hit limits when much information was not centrally stored or did not exist in official records. Investigators had to rely heavily on community memory and subjective judgments, a factor that could illuminate social ties, but also risked bias from rumors, emotions, or desire to protect acquaintances. During screening, no one in the familiar group showed behavioral signs strong enough to become a primary suspect, as most had relatively clear alibis, or no realistic opportunity to remove Robert without detection. The absence of a standout suspect in this group forced the investigation to expand to strangers who might have entered the family's living space without leaving clear traces, a far more difficult direction due to lack of specific identifying data. Tracing potential strangers became complex when initial descriptions of appearance and behavior were generic, insufficient for narrowing down, and no independent evidence confirmed a suspicious person's presence at the critical moment. Investigators tried matching vague descriptions to reports of strangers in the area at the same time, but random overlaps in common traits yielded no clear results. Efforts to trace based on transportation also faced similar obstacles, as there was no confirmed information on how Robert was removed, and all guesses about vehicles or routes lacked verification. Parallel to identifying people, leads collected in the early phase were re-evaluated to find details possibly overlooked or misplaced in context. However, most leads were indirect, not strong enough for specific action, and many reflected the typical information chaos in early child disappearance cases. Some initial tips, when cross-checked against the timeline, proved inconsistent in time or location, and had to be discarded to avoid derailing the investigation. Other leads, while not clearly contradictory, lacked independent verification, preventing their use as a basis for suspect identification. Evaluating unsubstantiated leads became a key part of this phase, as retaining unverified information could misdirect the investigation and waste valuable resources without improving chances of reaching the truth. Investigators had to make tough calls on pursuing or dropping each lead amid heavy pressure from family and community, with expectations for quick answers growing harder to meet. Some individuals initially noted were gradually cleared as no supporting evidence emerged, but these exclusions brought no clear sense of progress. Each name crossed off only highlighted the lack of a convincing alternative direction. Overlaps in social connections, incomplete witness memories, and information storage limits made reconstructing Robert's contact network fragmented, lacking detail to pinpoint anyone with suspicious behavior. In that context, suspect and lead screening shifted from expecting answers to ensuring no obvious possibility was unreasonably overlooked, a preventive goal more than a breakthrough. Investigators recognized that failing to find a suspect in this phase did not invalidate the abduction hypothesis, but reflected the reality that the act, if it occurred, was executed with high discretion, fully exploiting brief supervision gaps and the technological limits of the era's investigation. As the potential suspect list narrowed without revealing a standout individual, and existing leads could not turn into concrete evidence, the investigation began entering a suspended state, where all efforts were maintained at maximum feasible level, but the feeling that the case was slipping beyond resolution by traditional methods grew increasingly evident. From the suspended state of the suspect and lead review phase, where no individual could convincingly remain under suspicion, and all gathered information lacked the ability to be converted into concrete evidence, the investigation gradually entered a more difficult stage, one in which the sense of progress nearly vanished, even though activities continued in name only. The absence of new leads became the most prominent characteristic of this phase, as each day passed without an important call, without a new witness appearing, without any unexpected discovery strong enough to alter the established approach. The information received afterward was mostly repetitions of old details in different forms, or emotional speculations from the community that lacked the reliability to be incorporated into the formal investigation process. The investigators continued to review what they already had, but repeatedly examining the same limited data set only highlighted the reality that the investigation was operating within a closed information space, with no new elements introduced to break the deadlock. The technological and data limitations of the 1960s became an increasingly clear barrier, as every investigative method relied almost entirely on human memory, paper records, and manual cross-referencing, while tools that could expand the search scope or objectively verify information simply did not exist. There was no federal database of missing children for comparison, no centralized storage system, allowing quick reviews of similar cases in other areas, and no technical means to trace an individual's movements after leaving the scene, confining all efforts to broaden the investigation to the known geographic scope and information. Reliance on scattered records and unstable witness statements increased the risk of errors, while forcing investigators to constantly weigh whether to continue digging into increasingly faint details or to accept that some questions might remain unanswered under current conditions. As time passed without clear progress, resources allocated to the case began to naturally decline, not due to indifference or deliberate abandonment, but because investigative units had to address other cases with higher urgency and clearer potential for resolution. Personnel who had been actively involved in the early days were gradually reassigned to other tasks, the frequency of file reviews decreased, and field search activities were no longer maintained at previous high levels, as there was no new basis to justify continued large-scale resource mobilization. The case remained administratively open, but in practice, it began to slide away from priority status in the daily workload, a quiet process with profound impact on the investigation's ability to advance further. Meanwhile, Robert's family clearly felt this shift, even if not always directly informed, as the gradual reduction in investigative activity was reflected in small details like fewer contacts, increasingly vague responses, and the absence of specific updates on search progress. The initial loss, already a major shock, gradually turned into a prolonged state of waiting, where each passing day carried faint hope for new news, but also eroded confidence in the case being resolved anytime soon. The family continued to cooperate with police, providing information again when requested, but the sense that all efforts were heading into a dead end increasingly drained their spirits, and the relationship between the family and the investigative force shifted from active expectation to passive acceptance. The erosion of trust did not happen suddenly, but accumulated through each fruitless contact, each search ending in silence, and each vague assurance that the case was still under review, but without any concrete signs of progress. For the investigators, this phase also brought considerable psychological pressure, as they faced the limits of their own methods and tools, while fully aware that failing to find answers did not mean they had exhausted all possibilities, yet they could not point to a viable alternative path under existing conditions. The investigation's ceiling was thus not an official decision or a clear moment, but the result of converging factors: the depletion of leads, technological limits, declining resources, and prolonged psychological impact on both the investigative force and the victim's family. As efforts continued at the minimum level needed to avoid closing the case, but no longer strong enough to create a breakthrough, Robert's disappearance gradually fell into a quiet existence within the system, still recorded as unsolved, but no longer pursued with the intensity of the early days. In that state, the investigation neither ended nor truly advanced, trapped between the desire to uncover the truth and the reality that all available tools had been used to their limits, leaving the family in a prolonged void of waiting, and the investigative force with a sense of helplessness before a case they could not answer, despite having exhausted every possible path in the era's conditions. From the state of an investigation that had hit its ceiling, where sustained efforts no longer produced any substantive change, Robert's disappearance gradually moved into a new phase that was not publicly announced, but clearly felt in the system's operations, the phase where the formal investigation effectively stalled. There was no specific timeline marking the moment the case was closed, as procedurally the file remained open, but in reality, active investigative activities nearly ceased when no new leads remained to pursue, and no reasonable basis existed to continue high-level resource mobilization. Periodic reviews became infrequent, requests for information updates from the family no longer led to concrete actions, and the case gradually slipped from the local investigative force's priority list, making way for other cases with greater urgency or clearer short-term resolution potential. The stalling of the investigation did not mean the case was immediately forgotten, but rather a gradual process in which the lack of progress eroded motivation to pursue it, until maintaining the case became largely formal. In that context, Robert's file was placed in storage, becoming a thickening paper dossier over time, but no longer frequently opened, containing reports, statements, search diagrams, and investigative notes compiled in the first months after the boy's disappearance. This storage followed the standard procedures of the era, where unsolved cases were filed in physical archives, categorized by year and case type, and retrieved only upon specific request, or when new information sufficiently convincing to justify restarting the investigation emerged. Once placed in storage, access to the file became far more restricted, not just physically, but psychologically, as a case in storage often signified it had reached the limits of what could be done under current conditions. Parallel to the file storage was the gradual change in personnel directly handling the case, as initial investigators were successively reassigned, retired, or transferred, leaving the case in the hands of those who had not directly experienced the intense early investigation phase. This personnel change did not occur all at once, but in small steps, yet each handover lost some of the tacit knowledge accumulated from hands-on experience, details not on paper, but held in the memories of those directly involved. Even a complete documentary file could not fully replace the deep understanding of context, scene intuition, and judgments formed during the initial investigation, and as those holding those memories were no longer directly involved, the case became more a collection of disjointed information than a coherent story. For later investigators receiving the file, the case resembled a puzzle attempted many times without solution, limiting motivation to invest further time and effort amid resources always allocated to other priorities. Meanwhile, for Robert's family, the case shifting to a near-frozen state carried entirely different meaning, as they saw no distinction between investigation stalled and abandoned, a feeling that grew clearer as official police contacts dwindled. No more regular update calls, no more meetings to discuss progress, and responses became increasingly generic, reflecting the reality that the system no longer actively pursued the case. Faced with this marked decline in official investigative activity, the family had to confront the difficult choice between accepting the status quo or continuing the search themselves, and for them stopping meant abandoning hope, something they were not ready to do. The family began independent search efforts, using personal connections, community support, and any accessible information sources, knowing breakthrough chances were slim. These efforts were scattered and lacked the professional coordination of the official phase, but they reflected determination not to let the case fade into oblivion, even as all signs indicated the system had reached its limits. The family continued asking questions, monitoring other missing child cases, and nurturing hope that someday something would emerge to change the situation, though faith in active official intervention had been significantly eroded. In this state, Robert's disappearance existed in parallel in two different worlds, one the official system where the file was stored and minimally maintained, the other the family's life where the loss was never put away, and questions about the boy's fate remained in every daily decision. The transition to cold case was not declared by announcement or specific decision, but occurred as an irreversible slide, where the case gradually lost its place in the investigative force's workflow, yet occupied an ever larger space in the memories and emotional lives of those left behind. As the file lay dormant in storage and official efforts became merely sustaining, the case entered a new phase, where time was no longer measured in hours or days, as in the beginning, but in months and years passing in silence, leaving behind a prolonged void between what had been done and what never had the chance to be explored in that era's conditions. While Robert's disappearance gradually fell into stasis within the investigative system, with the file stored and official activities nearly halted, the boy's life continued to develop quietly in a completely different space, absolutely separated from the story his birth family and authorities had pursued. Robert grew up in another family without any memory or conscious trace of ever belonging elsewhere, as at the time he was taken, he was only 9 months old, an age when long-term memory had not yet formed, and all experiences quickly faded. The only reality Robert knew was the environment of the family raising him, where the adults around him played an absolute role in shaping concepts of parents, safety and personal origins. In that world, Robert was raised as a normal child, with daily needs consistently met, developmental milestones noted in familiar ways, and no clear incident strong enough to cause prolonged unease. The raising family, somehow, had established an outwardly stable living context where everything from daily routines and educational environment to social relationships functioned smoothly, showing no signs of breakdown or constant conflict. In this setting, Robert had no reason to suspect his life was the result of a major past rupture, as everything he encountered was consistent and aligned with the common image of a normal family. Stories about origins, if mentioned, were presented simply enough to satisfy a child's limited curiosity, without prompting deeper questions, and in a society not yet emphasizing identity verification, those explanations were accepted without need for proof. Robert's childhood was thus filled with familiar experiences like school, friends, daily activities, and small memories, all combining into a continuous flow that made the concept of a different past unnecessary in his awareness. This stable environment played a key role in preventing suspicion, as when no clear contradiction existed between experience and explanation, a child's mind tends to accept reality as obvious. The raising family, whatever its motives or circumstances, maintained a high enough level of consistency to avoid creating cognitive gaps, and that consistency meant details that might later seem unusual were not prominent enough to draw attention at the time. As Robert entered adolescence, his awareness expanded, social relationships diversified, and individual personality formed, but even then, no clear signs forced him to seriously question his origins. Physical differences, if any, could easily be explained by general genetic variation, and fleeting family questions were answered reasonably enough to avoid prolonged doubt. Personal documents met ordinary daily and educational requirements, and in the era's loose data management, incomplete or missing records were not uncommon, further reducing chances Robert would notice inconsistencies. The sense of belonging to the raising family strengthened over time through shared experiences, family rituals, and repeated memories, year after year, creating what seemed a seamless personal history, without breaks. In that environment, not knowing true origins created no psychological void, as people typically feel absence only when having a standard for comparison, and for Robert, no other standard existed beyond his lived reality. The outward life stability not only concealed the truth, but acted as a psychological buffer, allowing Robert to develop without carrying ongoing insecurity or loss, factors that often drive someone to probe the past. Even viewed from outside, Robert's life in this period showed none of the typical signs of a child who had suffered severe trauma, as the rupture occurred too early to leave conscious marks. The initial absence of suspicion was thus not unusual but the natural outcome of circumstances arranged to appear reasonable and complete. Over the years, the distance between the life Robert was living and the original disappearance widened, to the point the two stories existed as parallel lines with no intersection, one frozen in old files, the other continuing in real life with entirely different concerns. This separation grew stronger as time passed without external disruption, making reconnection between the two worlds increasingly remote in Robert's own perception. In this phase, he did not exist as a victim in the usual sense of missing person cases, but as a complete individual with his own life, relationships, and identity accepted both internally and externally. That is what makes the childhood elsewhere phase a crucial part of the story, as it shows the disappearance was not just a moment of deprivation, but a prolonged process where a person could be severed from their origins without ever realizing it, living fully in another reality, until sufficiently strong factors emerged to shatter that seemingly perfect continuity. After a childhood that passed with a sense of normality and continuity, the subsequent years of Robert's life began to reveal very small but persistent gaps, not large enough to disrupt daily life, yet sufficient to exist as blurry spots that he could not fully fill with familiar explanations. The first and foundational gap among all others lay in the newborn records, which should have been the clearest part of a person's history, but instead appeared deficient, fragmented, and inconsistent. The information related to the time of birth, place of birth, initial medical conditions, and details typically recorded systematically in hospitals or maternity facilities was not fully present in the documents Robert accessed as he grew older. And this deficiency was initially not seen as a serious abnormality because, in the social context of that era, many records were created manually, easily lost, or incomplete. However, it was precisely the prolonged ambiguity of these newborn data that created an unstable foundation for the story of his origins that Robert had been told, because when the most basic details could not be clearly confirmed, every other explanation carried a sense of patching rather than certainty. Information about Robert's origins existed in the form of scattered anecdotes, enough to create a general picture but lacking specific milestones, and whenever mentioned, they were often presented in a way that avoided details that might lead to further questions. There was no absolute consistency regarding the circumstances of his birth, the early days after birth, or the people who had directly witnessed that period, and this lack of consistency did not draw immediate attention, but gradually accumulated over time. As Robert entered an age old enough to realize that the stories about his past did not have the tight structure he saw in others, mismatches in details began to appear at seemingly very ordinary moments, when comparing simple timelines, cross-referencing information told at different times, or realizing that the same question could receive different answers depending on the circumstances and the person answering. These differences were initially explained as harmless mistakes or imperfect adult memories, but their repetition and the fact that they were never fully clarified turned them into gaps with increasingly clear shapes in Robert's awareness. The lack of complete newborn records also led to the absence of tangible evidence typically associated with early life, items that many families keep as mementos or proof of a child's presence from birth, and this absence made Robert's past more abstract compared to the present he was living. When questions about origins were raised, the common response was evasion, not through direct refusal, but by redirecting the conversation, downplaying the issue's importance, or providing vague answers sufficient to end the exchange without sparking further curiosity. These responses did not appear as a deliberate conspiracy in the eyes of a child or teenager, but rather as the habit of adults unwilling to delve into a sensitive topic, and it was this very ambiguity that made it difficult for Robert to determine whether these gaps held special meaning or were merely products of circumstance. Over time, the evaded questions did not disappear, but existed alongside everyday life, pushed into the background whenever there was no direct reason to bring them up, only to return whenever a new mismatched detail appeared. These details were not large enough to shatter the sense of stability Robert had, yet sufficient to create a faint layer of doubt, not directed toward a specific conclusion, but existing merely as the feeling that his own story had segments yet to be told. The fact that these gaps were not thoroughly resolved made them gradually become part of the cognitive structure, where Robert learned to accept that some questions lacked clear answers, especially when those questions seemed not to directly affect current life. However, this acceptance did not mean the gaps vanished, it only temporarily covered them with other concerns, like studies, social relationships, and the process of forming personal identity. In that context, the deficiencies in newborn records and origin information did not create an immediate identity crisis, but they laid the groundwork for a vague sense of incompleteness, a realization that something in his story remained unfinished. Each time mismatched details were noticed, Robert tended to self-adjust by seeking the most reasonable explanations within the available information, because asking deeper questions meant facing the possibility that the people he trusted most were hiding something. The adult's evasion, thus, not only prevented clarification of the past, but also helped maintain the suspended state of these gaps, keeping them unresolved, yet not seen as serious enough to force confrontation. Over time, these gaps became missing pieces in the puzzle of childhood, not enough to change how Robert viewed his current life, but enough to exist as a silent foundation for unanswered questions. They did not manifest as conflict or rebellion, but as fleeting thoughts, unconscious comparisons with others' stories, and moments of realizing that his past seemed to lack the expected level of detail. In this phase, the gaps in childhood did not lead Robert to any specific action to seek the truth, as they had not yet converged enough to form a clear suspicion, but they quietly accumulated, awaiting a strong enough factor to link them into a larger question about identity and origins, a question that at this point still lacked clear shape, but had begun to exist as a possibility that could not be entirely ignored. From the vague gaps in childhood that were not large enough to disrupt existing stability, Robert entered adulthood with a relatively complete mindset, carrying an accepted identity that functioned stably in social life without encountering any clear obstacles. Robert's maturation process followed the familiar trajectory of an individual well integrated into his surroundings, where social relationships gradually formed through education, work, and personal experiences, and where he learned to define himself through roles in the community, rather than through his origin story. The gaps in the past, though still existing at a certain level of awareness, did not dominate daily decisions, as current life provided enough structure and goals to fulfill the need for meaning and direction. Robert built a relatively stable path for himself, learning to adapt to social norms, developing necessary work skills, and maintaining relationships based on trust and everyday interactions, without realizing that his identity foundation was built on an incomplete story. Upon entering the workforce, Robert approached work as a means of self-affirmation and establishing independence, and in that process, the legal identity he used operated smoothly, without causing obstacles or suspicions large enough to require re-examining its origins. Personal documents served adequately for job applications, contracts, and social activities, and in a context where data management was not yet tightly interconnected, potential deficiencies did not manifest as specific problems. Robert was thus able to integrate into society as a complete individual, without being questioned about the validity of his identity, and without encountering administrative or social barriers, often associated with unclear origins. When building his own life, Robert continued to rely on what he knew and trusted, forming romantic relationships, and starting a family in a way that reflected a desire for stability and connection, partly stemming from an unconscious need to compensate for nameless gaps in the past. Robert's own family was built on a foundation of normality, with familiar responsibilities, obligations, and expectations, and in that space, he played the role of a responsible adult, not significantly different from those around him. The identity Robert carried in this phase was reinforced not only by documents or family stories, but by social recognition from work roles, relationships, and community position, making it increasingly solid and hard to shake. This outward stability completely obscured the possibility that something mismatched lay deeper, as in everyday life, Robert did not face situations requiring cross-verification of his identity with another data source. Questions about the past, if they occasionally arose, were quickly overshadowed by present priorities, as maintaining work, caring for family, and meeting social responsibilities demanded constant focus. In this phase, Robert had no awareness that he might be connected to a missing person case, let alone a decades-long cold case, as no external information reached his life strongly enough to trigger that connection. The 1965 disappearance existed entirely outside Robert's awareness, buried in record systems and others' memories, while his life continued to develop along an independent trajectory, not intersecting with the abandoned past. This separation was not only a result of passing time, but also of the false identity being reinforced over years of unchallenged use, making it an inseparable part of how Robert understood himself. In Robert's eyes, he was the sum of lived experiences, built relationships, and made choices, rather than the product of an event that occurred before he could remember. Therefore, not knowing his connection to a cold case was not merely a lack of information, but the consequence of a long process where all signs linking the two stories had been blurred or completely erased. The adult years passed without any collision between current life and the hidden past, making the possibility that these two worlds once belonged together increasingly unimaginable, not only for Robert, but for anyone viewing his life from the outside. This outwardly stable identity provided Robert with a sense of security and continuity, helping him build a structured and meaningful life according to familiar social standards, but it also inadvertently created a protective shell that prevented deeper questions about origins from surfacing. In this phase, Robert did not exist as someone seeking answers, but as an individual who had found his place in society, unaware that this very stability was built on a story never fully told. Maturing in a false identity thus did not carry the appearance of conscious deception, but was a natural process where a person grew up, adapted, and integrated based on what was given, living fully in an unquestioned reality, and completely unaware that elsewhere, in old case files, his name still existed as a 9-month-old child who had vanished without a trace. From the foundation of an adult life operating smoothly in an accepted identity, the first signs of discrepancy appeared not as a sudden shock, but as small, scattered, and hard-to-pinpoint cracks, only becoming noticeable when placed side by side over time. Inconsistencies in personal documents were the clearest triggering factor, as information that should have been absolutely uniform across record types revealed asynchrony, not in major details that caused immediate disruption, but in seemingly minor points like date formatting, place of birth, or sequences of information related to the newborn period. For many years, these differences could be explained as administrative errors, especially in a context where records were created manually and transferred across various systems, but their repeated appearance in different situations made them no longer easy to dismiss. Encounters with new administrative procedures, deeper information verification requirements, or situations needing data cross-referencing between agencies exposed mismatches that had previously gone unscrutinized, and each time, Robert had to confront the feeling that his identity story had parts that did not fully align with the reality on paper. Alongside administrative inconsistencies were medical and genetic issues that began to reveal their role as harder-to-explain signals, as they touched on aspects not easily covered by ordinary social explanations. When facing questions about family medical history, genetic traits, or inherited health factors, Robert realized that the information he had was insufficient for certain answers, and substitutes provided were often vague, lacking detail or avoiding key points. In some cases, differences between his own medical characteristics and what was expected based on the fostering family's information became harder to explain by chance, forcing Robert to acknowledge that certain biological factors were not fully accounted for in the story he had long believed. Medical questions, practical and less emotional, became stronger catalysts than any abstract doubt, as they demanded specific answers with direct consequences for current life. When document inconsistencies and medical signs were placed together, they began forming a pattern impossible to easily ignore, though each individual factor could still be explained in the least concerning way. It was the convergence of these many small details that shaped an initial suspicion about origins, not a clear conclusion, but a feeling that his origin story might be less complete than told. This suspicion did not appear as crisis or immediate denial but as a smoldering question, repeating in seemingly unrelated moments, each time reinforced by a new mismatch. Robert began revisiting childhood gaps in a different light, realizing that evaded questions were not just fragments of adult memory, but possibly signs of something deeper that had been concealed or simply never revealed. The formation of suspicion about origins did not occur in a short time, but was the result of an accumulating awareness process, where scattered pieces were gradually placed together to form a picture no longer entirely internally contradictory. This feeling created a subtle shift in how Robert viewed his identity, as for the first time, he no longer saw it as self-evident but as a story that might need verification. This shift carried clear inner conflict, as questioning origins meant challenging foundational relationships that had shaped his life for years. The need to uncover the truth thus stemmed not from mere curiosity, but from the urge to resolve contradictions gradually becoming impossible to ignore, especially as they began affecting practical decisions related to health, legal matters, and the future. However, this need coexisted with hesitation, as Robert was aware that delving into the past could lead to unpredictable consequences, not only for himself, but for those bonded to him throughout life. Weighing between continuing to accept an incomplete story and facing the possibility that the truth could upend everything became a prolonged inner process, where each step toward answers came with anxiety about what might be lost. In this phase, Robert did not yet act decisively to seek the truth, but his awareness had irreversibly changed, as the signs of discrepancy were no longer isolated details, but a system suggesting that his current identity might not reflect the full story. The formation of suspicion thus marked a significant turning point, not in outward action, but in how Robert understood himself, as for the first time he allowed the possibility that his past might contain a truth different from what had been accepted for years. The need to uncover the truth, though not yet concretized into a clear plan, began influencing how he approached identity-related information, making each new discovered contradiction no longer easily dismissed, but noted as part of a larger question gradually forming. In that context, the first signs of discrepancy were no longer minor anomalies, but became the foundation for a deeper awareness process, where Robert stood at the threshold of choosing between continuing to live in a familiar but incomplete story, or facing the possibility that the truth about his origins might lie in a completely different place, beyond any frame of reference he had ever known. From the doubts that had formed and could no longer be dismissed, the decision to take a DNA test came to Robert not as an impulsive act, but as the logical next step in a process of realization that had quietly accumulated over many years, where discrepancies in documents, medical gaps, and a sense of inconsistency about his origins converged enough to create a need for verification through what was considered the most objective means available. The choice of a civil DNA test did not stem from an intent to seek a sensational story or to dramatically overturn the past, but from a desire to obtain a clear answer, regardless of whether that answer would confirm or refute the existing doubts. At this point, DNA testing had become a more common tool in civilian life, promoted as a way to explore ancestral origins, connect with relatives, and supplement personal knowledge, and it was precisely this harmless veneer that made Robert's decision feel less like a direct confrontation with the truth and more like a safe probe. When the DNA sample was sent off, Robert still held on to the hope that the results might reinforce the story he had lived with all this time, that the doubts were merely coincidences of administrative errors and random differences, and that his current identity would be confirmed by irrefutable scientific evidence. However, the returned results did not bring the reassurance he had hoped for. Instead, they placed Robert face to face with a reality irreconcilable with the familiar narrative, as the genetic data did not match the family he had believed to be his own. This mismatch did not appear as a vague conclusion, but as a clear absence in close blood relations, where direct matches should have existed, but were entirely missing. Robert's initial reaction was not panic, but a rational denial, seeking alternative explanations such as technical errors, database limitations, or the possibility that the results were not comprehensive enough for a definitive conclusion. However, as the parameters were examined more closely and mitigating hypotheses were successively ruled out, the truth gradually emerged as something unavoidable. Robert's DNA did not reflect a blood relationship with the family he was living with. The appearance of distant relatives in the analysis results further intensified this shock, as unexpected genetic connections began to surface, pointing to individuals sharing genetic material to a certain degree, but completely unknown in Robert's life. These names were not tied to memories, held no place in the familiar family story, and their presence in the DNA results posed a fundamental question that could not be answered with old explanations. If these were relatives, then who was Robert's real family? The emergence of distant relatives did not immediately provide specific answers, but it offered undeniable proof that Robert's genetic identity lay in a different network, separate from the relationships he had taken for granted. It was at this moment that his sense of identity began to fracture clearly, as the difference between the lived story and the scientific data could no longer be reconciled through the flexibility of memory or emotional explanations. Robert faced a profound paradox. Every experience, relationship and responsibility in his current life remained valid and meaningful, yet their biological foundation did not align with the story that had nurtured those experiences. This fracture did not occur as a single moment, but spread gradually, affecting how Robert viewed his past, present, and even future, because if the genetic identity did not match, then assumptions about origins, family history, and even personal traits needed to be re-examined. The appearance of distant relatives brought a feeling that was both familiar and alien, as it suggested that there were people out there with a biological connection to Robert, yet without any emotional foundation or shared memories to bridge the gap. This created a particular form of cognitive tension, where biological truth did not automatically translate into a sense of belonging, and where the question, "Who am I?" became far more complex than simply determining blood relations. In this context, civil DNA was no longer a tool for curious exploration, but became a factor that upended the cognitive structure, forcing Robert to acknowledge that the identity he had lived with did not reflect the full truth about himself. This cognitive fracture triggered a chain of internal reactions, from confusion and anxiety to a sense of disorientation, because when the most fundamental foundation was questioned, every other point of reference became less secure. Robert began to revisit past anomalies in a new light, realizing that document discrepancies, unanswered medical questions, and evasive responses from adults were not isolated details, but pieces of a larger story that had been obscured. The decision to take a DNA test, initially seen as a relatively safe verification step, now became the door to an entirely different reality, where questions about origins were no longer hypothetical, but an issue requiring resolution. The existence of distant relatives in the DNA data created a new perspective, but also heightened the sense of uncertainty, as it confirmed that a different biological history awaited discovery, while not immediately providing a clear path to access that history. At this stage, Robert could no longer return to his previous carefree state, as the new knowledge had altered how he understood himself, even though he did not yet know how to proceed. Civil DNA, with its appearance of objectivity and neutrality, had accomplished what no prior question or doubt had, shattering the consistency of his current identity and forcing Robert to confront the possibility that his life had been built on a foundation that had never been fully told. This fracture was not just a personal crisis, but the intersection of science and memory, where emotionless data directly confronted the stories that had shaped a person, creating a profound but irreversible state of instability. In this context, the decision to take a DNA test, the mismatched results, the appearance of distant relatives, and the cognitive fracture of identity were no longer separate events, but formed a closed logical chain, pushing Robert to the threshold of a journey to uncover the truth, one whose depth and consequences he could not yet imagine at this point, but for which he had no choice but to acknowledge that the story of himself had just entered an entirely different chapter. From the cognitive fracture brought about by the civil DNA results, Robert was compelled to shift from a state of passive confusion to a more structured process of inquiry, where the genetic data was no longer a solitary shocking discovery, but became the starting point for a systematic chain of analysis. The analysis of the DNA data began with a detailed examination of match levels, clearly distinguishing between the near non-existent connections to the family he was living with, and the faint but consistent connections to completely unknown individuals, identified as distant relatives, based on the percentage of shared genetic material. These numbers, though devoid of emotional meaning, provided a logical structure that Robert could rely on to trace his biological trail, as they were not influenced by memory or narrative, but reflected objective blood relationships. From the initial data, building a family tree became the inevitable next step, as the individuals appearing in the DNA results were placed into a hypothetical network of relations based on match levels, estimated ages, and publicly accessible information. This process did not unfold seamlessly, but required patience, as each branch of the family tree provided only partial information, and many connections had to be verified, eliminated, or adjusted as new data emerged. Robert gradually realized that the family tree was not a static diagram, but a flexible structure, continually changing as relationships were clarified or disproven, and it was this flexibility that made the genealogy investigation open-ended, not leading immediately to conclusions, but steadily narrowing the search scope. As the family tree branches began to take shape, geography emerged as an important filtering tool, since the distant relatives in the DNA data were not randomly distributed, but tended to cluster around certain areas, reflecting the migration and settlement history of the related families. Narrowing down relevant geography was not aimed at immediately identifying a specific location, but at ruling out incompatible possibilities, shrinking the space where Robert's origin story might have begun. When locations were compared alongside Robert's birth timeline, some areas became less plausible due to lack of temporal overlap or insufficiently strong genealogical ties, while others gradually stood out as intersection points between genetic data and historical context. The narrowing of match possibilities occurred through a combination of elimination and confirmation, where each new assumption had to be cross-checked against DNA data, public information, and temporal logic, and any contradictions had to be resolved before proceeding further. This process did not bring a sense of rapid progress, but it created a feeling of control that Robert had lacked in the initial DNA shock phase, as for the first time, he was not merely reacting to information, but actively restructuring his story, based on evidence. As the family tree became more detailed, the initially distant relationships began to converge on certain common branches, suggesting the possible existence of biological parents, or an origin family, at the intersection of these connections, even though specific identities remained undetermined. Analyzing the DNA data at this stage was not just about reading numbers, but placing them within a broader social and historical context, considering factors such as common childbearing ages, family patterns, and living conditions of the relevant era. Robert had to continually balance adhering to objective data and avoiding letting emotional speculation overpower the analysis, as any misstep could distort the entire emerging family tree structure. As the geographic scope narrowed gradually, a feeling that the truth was no longer out of reach began to emerge, but it also brought new pressure, as each step closer to an answer meant facing the potential consequences of that truth. Narrowing match possibilities did not immediately yield a specific name or family, but it eliminated the infinite ambiguity that had existed before, replacing it with a finite search space with clearer boundaries. Within that space, each new detail could be evaluated based on its fit with the established structure, and mismatched details were more easily detected and discarded than in the phase relying solely on emotional suspicion. The genealogy investigation thus became an important bridge between the initial shock of civil DNA and the ability to access a more concrete truth, where science no longer only served to dismantle the old identity, but began building a new foundation for understanding origins. Though no clear conclusion had been reached, the analysis of data, construction of the family tree, geographic narrowing, and reduction of match possibilities had created a structure solid enough for Robert to continue forward without being overwhelmed by complete uncertainty. At this stage, the journey to uncover the truth was no longer a reaction to a shocking discovery, but had become a methodical process where each step was based on careful consideration of data, logic, and context, and where the truth, though not yet named, had begun to appear as a more concrete possibility than ever in Robert's awareness. From the increasingly clear family tree structure, and the geographic scope narrowed enough to no longer be vaguely speculative, Robert's investigation entered a more sensitive phase, where genetic data began to touch specific historical records, and the possibility that his origin story was linked to an officially documented event first became tangible. The discovery of a matching missing person case did not occur as a dramatic moment, but as a gradual recognition, as details about age, birth timing, geographic area, and social context were placed side by side and revealed intersections too significant to be considered coincidental. In the process of reviewing public sources and archived data, a missing person case from 1965 emerged as a noteworthy convergence point, not because it matched perfectly from the start, but because it aligned with enough foundational elements to demand serious consideration. Matching birth data and timelines became the next decisive analytical step, as dates were carefully compared, from the estimated time of Robert's birth to the period when the disappearance was reported, and initial small discrepancies were reasonably explained within the context of administrative errors and manual record-keeping of that era. Information about birth locations, though not perfectly matching on paper, made logical sense when placed within the framework of movement and daily life of the related families at that time, forming a chain of possibilities that could not be easily dismissed. When genetic data was placed alongside details from the missing person case, the degree of match was no longer just a subjective feeling, but was assessed based on the overlap of multiple independent factors, from genealogical relations and timelines to social and geographic context. Evaluating the degree of match thus did not seek absolute similarity, rare in old records, but aimed to determine whether differences could be reasonably explained, and whether the overall data formed a more consistent story than any other scenario. In this case, each individual element might not have been convincing on its own, but when combined, they formed a logical structure that made the potential connection between Robert and the 1965 missing person case increasingly difficult to deny. However, identifying a matching case did not mean accepting it as the final truth, as the next step required utmost caution, since any mistake could lead to erroneously linking two independent stories. Robert had to confront the reality that if this connection was correct, it would carry profound legal and emotional consequences, not only for himself, but also for the families involved, and therefore, verification could not rely solely on personal analysis. The decision to contact authorities emerged as a necessary step to shift from an independent investigation to an official process, where data could be verified with proper authority and resources. This contact was not made as a demand for immediate resolution, but as an informational action, providing details and suggesting consideration of the potential link between the DNA data and the long-archived missing person case. When the information was submitted, it was presented in a way that focused on objective facts, avoiding emotional speculation, with the goal of allowing authorities to assess the degree of fit based on professional standards. The initial response from authorities was cautious, as old cases often come with complexities, and reopening an investigation requires sufficiently solid grounds to justify resource allocation. In this context, evaluating the degree of match became the focus of all exchanges, as involved parties had to weigh the possibility of uncovering the truth against the risk of creating unrealistic expectations for those who had waited for decades. For Robert, this phase marked a transition from a personal journey to a more collective process, where his question of origins was no longer just a private matter, but began intersecting with official history and systemic responsibility. The connection to the 1965 case not only opened the possibility of explaining the gaps in Robert's life, but also placed him in a position to confront a story that had existed independently for a very long time, with the pain, hope, and waiting of other people. Matching birth data and timelines, thus, was not just a technical operation, but a process of placing two timelines side by side on the same plane to see whether they could merge into a single story. As details continued to be compared, and pieces gradually fit together, a feeling that the truth was very close began to emerge, but it also brought anxiety that confirming this connection would not bring simplicity or immediate closure. Contacting authorities became the intersection between past and present, between a dormant case and a person seeking answers, and it was at that intersection that Robert's story began to move beyond the personal sphere into a space where truth needed to be confirmed through procedure, evidence, and official responsibility. In this phase, every step was taken with restraint, as each decision had the potential to alter how the story was understood and retold. And the discovery of a matching missing person case was no longer just an intellectual finding, but the threshold of a process of confronting history that Robert, until this point, had only stood outside of. From the moment the connection between Robert's genetic data and the 1965 missing person case was presented in a structured manner to the authorities, the case officially emerged from its decades-long dormant state and entered an entirely different phase, where the modern investigative system began to take center stage. The initial information was forwarded to the unit responsible for unsolved cases, and the cold case unit took on the matter not as a completely new file, but as a case that needed to be reassessed from the ground up in light of data that did not exist at the original time. This intake was accompanied by a rigorous screening process, in which investigators had to determine whether the new information was sufficiently reliable and directly relevant to justify reopening a long-stalled investigation. Since each cold case that is reactivated involves significant resource allocation and high expectations from those involved. When the genetic factors, timeline, and geographic area were placed side by side in a summary, they formed a logical chain convincing enough to pass the initial evaluation stage, prompting the cold case unit to officially place the case on its priority review list. The first step in the reactivation process was a comprehensive review of the old files, a task that was both technical and reinterpretative, because documents created in the context and investigative mindset of the 1960s could not be read in their original form if new value was to be extracted. The investigators sequentially re-examined the initial reports, witness statements, search diagrams, case classification decisions, and marginal notes left over the years, not just to grasp the content, but also to understand the assumptions, limitations, and choices that shaped the investigation at that time. During this review, details once deemed insufficiently important or impossible to pursue due to lack of technology were now placed in a new context, where genetic data and federal cross-referencing capabilities allowed them to be viewed with different value. The review of old files was not aimed at seeking individual errors, but at identifying the points where the original investigation was forced to stop due to the constraints of the era, thereby assessing the extent to which new information could fill the remaining gaps. Parallel to rereading the files, the cold case unit proceeded to verify the continuity of the data, cross-checking backups, checking document integrity, and ensuring that what remained after decades was still sufficient to support a serious investigative process. Once the file foundation was established, the next critical step was the collection of official DNA, a process entirely different from the civilian testing Robert had previously undergone. Official DNA was collected under strict legal protocols, with the goal of creating evidence of legal value that could be used in identity verification procedures and, if necessary, in judicial proceedings. This collection was not just to reconfirm existing data, but to ensure that all comparisons were conducted on a standardized basis, eliminating the possibility of discrepancies due to civilian methods or databases. The DNA samples were processed in the federal system, allowing cross-referencing with various records and creating an independent chain of verification separate from the prior personal inquiry process. For Robert, providing official DNA marked the complete transition from the role of someone seeking the truth for himself to that of an individual participating in an official investigation where every step was documented and subject to legal protocol adjustments. Parallel to the DNA, verifying legal documents became an indispensable pillar in the reactivation process because identity is not determined solely by genetics, but also by the chain of administrative documents tied to an individual's legal existence in society. Investigators began cross-referencing birth certificates, adoption records, residency registrations, and other related documents, looking for consistency or discrepancies that could explain the break in the origin story. This verification required coordination among multiple agencies, as the documents were created at different times, in different localities, and under inconsistent administrative standards, especially since some may have been produced to legitimize an identity that did not reflect biological truth. In this process, investigators had to clearly distinguish between unintentional administrative errors and intentional adjustments, a boundary not easy to determine, but decisive for correctly understanding the nature of the case. Reopening the investigation was thus not a direct continuation from where the old one stopped, but a complete restructuring of the entire case within a new frame of reference, where modern data allowed questions once unanswerable to now be posed seriously. The cold case unit not only served as a recipient of information, but also became a bridge between past and present, between a file once limited by the era's conditions and an investigative system capable of revisiting it with more powerful tools. As the pieces of official DNA and legal documents began to be placed side by side, the case gradually escaped its ambiguous state to enter a space of specific verification, where each new piece of data had to pass multiple layers of scrutiny before being accepted. In that context, reopening the investigation was not just technical in meaning, but also marked the return of a question left hanging for decades to the center of official attention, with the expectation that the limitations that once stalled the case could now be overcome through the combination of technology, protocols, and modern investigative approaches. From the investigation reactivation process with its rigorous verification steps regarding official DNA and legal documents, the pivotal moment of the case arrived, when the final DNA results were completed and synthesized in an independent chain of verification, allowing investigators to reach a conclusion that could not be achieved by any other method in the preceding decades. This result did not emerge as an isolated discovery, but as the convergence point of multiple layers of data, in which Robert's official DNA sample was cross-referenced with related records in the system, confirming the blood relationship matching the 1965 missing person case at a scientifically undeniable level. Potential errors were eliminated through repeated comparisons, independent reference standards, and cross-verification between laboratories, ensuring that the conclusion was not based on a single data source, but on the consistency of the entire analysis chain. When the result was confirmed, its significance extended beyond a technical answer, because for the first time, Robert's identity was reconnected to his biological history and the legal records separated since he was an infant. Confirming that the victim was alive became a turning point not only for the case, but also for how the system viewed the entire prior process, as it reversed the implicit assumption that prolonged silence meant a tragic outcome. For the cold case unit, this confirmation required an immediate adjustment in file handling, shifting the focus from searching for a missing child to verifying and updating the status of an existing adult individual with a different identity. The file status was officially updated, reflecting the fundamental change in the case, from an unresolved missing person incident to one where the victim had been identified and the survival status clarified, even though many other questions remained open. This update was not just administrative, but a historical milestone for the file, as it marked the first time since 1965 that information about Robert was adjusted based on authenticated evidence, rather than assumptions or speculation. The update process required coordination among different system departments to ensure that all related data reflected the new reality, from the victim's status to the verified identification information. Parallel to completing internal procedures, notifying involved parties was prepared with caution, as the sensitive nature of the information required careful consideration of timing, method, and scope of sharing. Relevant authorities were notified first to ensure unity in understanding and action, avoiding leaks that could harm those directly affected. Notifying Robert's biological family was carried out under a separate protocol, reflecting respect for the long wait and accumulated pain over the years, while preparing them to face a reality that brought both hope and potentially complex emotions. For Robert, being informed of the final DNA results not only confirmed suspicions that had formed, but also put an end to the prolonged ambiguous phase, where identity existed in a state of hesitation between different stories. The information was conveyed in a way focused on objective facts, to help Robert clearly understand the scientific and legal basis of the conclusion, while allowing him to accept the truth without being swept into speculation or immediate emotional pressure. Identity confirmation thus did not occur as an explosive moment, but as a gradual acceptance process, where each layer of meaning from the DNA results was understood and integrated into self-perception and the past. When the file status had been updated and involved parties notified, the case officially entered a new state in the system, where the question, "Where did Robert go?" was replaced by "How has Robert lived?" During the time separated from his biological family, this confirmation also forced the system to reflect on how child missing cases were once handled, as it showed that prolonged silence did not mean an end, and that era limitations could conceal the truth for decades. For the cold case unit, identity confirmation was not the end of responsibility, but the completion of a key objective, laying the foundation for subsequent steps built on verified truth. In that space, notifying involved parties became an act of connecting data to people, files to real life, and a frozen past to a newly redefined present. When all confirmation procedures were completed, Robert's identity was no longer a hypothesis or possibility, but an officially recognized reality, closing a long chapter of uncertainty and opening a new phase, where the truth had been named, but its consequences still awaited careful understanding and handling. From the moment Robert's identity was officially confirmed by DNA and the case file was updated, an unavoidable requirement for the investigative system was to look back at the entire 1965 process in light of what is now known, not to simply assign individual blame, but to understand why a child could disappear from his biological family life and live under a different identity for decades without detection. Comparing the original investigation to the current approach reveals structural differences rooted in the historical context, technology, and professional mindset of each era. In 1965, the investigation was conducted based on prevalent assumptions of the time, where missing children were often seen as results of accidents or getting lost rather than organized abduction, especially without clear signs of violence at the scene. Investigators then had to work in a system lacking interconnected data, without biometric tools, without a national missing children database, and relying almost entirely on witness statements and manual search capabilities. In contrast, The current investigation is built on DNA data, modern genealogy, federal cross-referencing capabilities, and a mindset that views an infant disappearing without trace as a high-risk indicator requiring a criminal approach from the start. When placing the two processes side by side, it becomes clear that many 1965 decisions, though reasonable in their era's context, inadvertently created systemic blind spots, particularly in not treating the scene as a potential crime space and not maximally preserving traces that might exist for only a short time. Identifying systemic errors thus does not focus on pointing out specific wrong actions, but on how foundational assumptions shape the entire investigative process, from case classification and resource allocation to the point when the case was pushed into a stalled state. One of the clearest errors identified was the lack of a long-term follow-up mechanism for child missing cases, making files easily archived when leads ran out, without a strong periodic review process to re-examine under new conditions. Additionally, the absence of identity verification tools meant that a child raised under a different identity going undetected for years was not unusual at the time, but a structural vulnerability in the entire population management system. When assessing accountability potential, the system had to confront clear legal limitations, as too much time had passed, many involved individuals were gone, files were incomplete, and statutes of limitations for potential acts had expired. This does not mean denying moral or social responsibility, but it draws a practical boundary between understanding what happened and the ability to apply corresponding legal measures in the present. This evaluation also highlights the difference between legal justice and truth-based justice, where in some cases, confirmation and accurate historical recording may be the most feasible outcome the system can achieve after decades. From a professional perspective, re-evaluating the old investigation yields important lessons, not only for similar past cases, but for handling current child missing incidents. One of the clearest lessons is the importance of assuming high risk from the outset, even without clear violent signs, because the absence of traces can sometimes be the sign of a calculated and discreet act. Another lesson lies in maintaining open files in a way that allows effective reactivation, ensuring that as investigative technology and methods advance, old cases can be systematically reviewed rather than depending on chance. Comparing the two eras also shows the value of biometric data and genealogy in breaking deadlocks once seen as permanent, while emphasizing that justice does not always arrive in the time frame people expect. For current investigators, looking back at the 1965 investigation is not about judging predecessors by today's standards, but about better understanding existing limitations and how to overcome them in the future. In this process, Robert's case becomes a typical example, showing how a system can fail, not due to lack of effort, but due to lack of tools, data, and a mindset suited to the problem's true nature. Drawing investigative lessons thus carries not only academic or professional meaning, but also deep humanistic significance, as each recorded lesson is a step toward minimizing the chance that other families endure prolonged waiting and irreversible rupture, like what occurred in this case. When the old investigation is placed under the light of the present, it is no longer a series of isolated failures or oversights, but becomes evidence of justice's evolution, where truth can be delayed by the era, but not necessarily erased forever, if the system is willing to learn from its own limitations. From the process of re-evaluating the entire old investigation and confirming the identity on a solid legal and scientific foundation, the system moved into a more human phase, where the focus was no longer on files or procedures, but on establishing connections between people who had been separated by time and circumstances. The establishment of contact between the parties was conducted cautiously, in a controlled manner, and step by step, as the authorities understood that this meeting was not merely about connecting information, but a direct collision between expectations, accumulated pain and unanswered questions over many decades. The involved parties were prepared in advance with basic information, not to soften the truth, but to avoid sudden shocks that could cause deep psychological trauma, especially for those who had lived in a prolonged state of waiting. When the communication channel was opened, all initial exchanges were orientational and neutral, focusing on confirming each other's existence in the present before touching on the complex emotions tied to the past. The in-person meeting, when finally arranged, did not unfold as a simple dramatic moment, but as an emotionally heavy event, where every gesture, glance, and silence carried the weight of years of loss. When Robert faced his biological family, the time gap could hardly be bridged by words, as between them was not just physical distance, but differences in life experiences, memories, and understandings of the same story. The initial psychological impact of the reunion was not uniform among the parties, as each person entered this moment with a different frame of reference, one side carrying the pain of deprivation, the other a sense of disorientation about identity, and all confronting the reality that there was no way to return to the time before the separation occurred. For Robert, this encounter both confirmed the biological truth and posed a profound cognitive challenge, as the new faces called his biological family held great significance but could not immediately become a familiar part of his mental life. The sense of belonging did not automatically emerge just because of blood ties, and this realization created a state of ambivalence, where Robert both felt the importance of the moment and was clearly aware that he could not immediately shift roles or emotions according to others' expectations. The biological family's reactions were also multi-layered, ranging from relief in knowing the victim was alive, to pain in realizing that the lost years could not be reclaimed, and confusion in facing an adult instead of the child they had waited for in their memories. Joy and sadness coexisted side by side, without canceling each other out, creating a complex emotional state where no reaction was entirely right or wrong. Some family members displayed strong emotions, while others reacted more reservedly, not due to lack of affection, but because they needed time to adjust their perception of the new reality. This meeting, therefore, did not bring immediate closure, but was like a belated starting point for a relationship that needed to be rebuilt from scratch, in a context where all parties carried their own wounds and limitations. The initial psychological impact was also evident in the underlying tension between expectations and actual possibilities, as the question of how to continue this connection still lacked a clear answer. For the investigation system, witnessing the reunion was not the end of the human task, but evidence that a once frozen file had now touched real life in the deepest way. However, the investigators were also clearly aware that legal and biological connection did not mean resolving all psychological consequences, and that the post-reunion adjustment process would be as prolonged and complex as any previous investigation phase. The family's reactions, therefore, were not just immediate emotional expressions, but a gradual process of learning to accept a new reality, where the hope once nurtured in silence was now replaced by a real person with their own history, identity, and independently formed life. The reunion, viewed from the outside, might be seen as a redemptive moment, but from the inside, it was a complex experience, where each person had to find their own way to reconcile the lost past with the unfolding present. In that context, establishing contact, the in-person meeting, the initial psychological impact, and the family's reactions did not form a complete ending, but a humane turning point, where the truth was finally placed at the center of human life, carrying both the potential for healing and new questions about how to live with an unchangeable history. From the emotional reunion moment that could not yet close the gaps spanning decades, the post-reunion phase quickly revealed deeper consequences, where the confirmed truth did not bring immediate stability, but opened a series of new crises revolving around identity, relationships, and each person's place in a family structure that had never existed before. The identity crisis emerged as a natural reaction when Robert had to reconcile the person he had become with the child who had once gone missing, two versions existing in parallel but unable to merge smoothly. Knowing his biological origins did not automatically bring a sense of completeness, as identity is not formed solely from bloodlines, but from life experiences, memories, and relationships shaped over decades. Robert had to face questions without simple answers about where he belonged, not just biologically, but emotionally and socially, as his current identity remained the result of a life built independently. This crisis did not occur once but repeated in seemingly minor situations, when each new interaction with his biological or adoptive family evoked a sense of hesitation between two worlds. The relationship between the biological and adoptive families became a sensitive space, where no ready script existed to navigate roles and expectations. The biological family carried the pain of deprivation and a desire to compensate, while the adoptive family faced a sense of being put on the defensive, even though they were the ones who had directly raised Robert to adulthood. The relationship between the two sides was not necessarily adversarial, but underlying tension always existed, as the new truth inadvertently questioned the legality and ethics of the past, even when no one in the present intended harm. Robert, at the center of this relationship, had to constantly adjust how he expressed emotions, avoiding hurting those who had raised him, while not denying the existence and significance of his biological family, a fragile balance requiring patience and high self-awareness. Alongside emotional challenges were emerging legal issues, as identity confirmation led to inevitable administrative consequences, from adjusting personal documents to determining rights, responsibilities, and the legal status of family relationships. These procedures were not dramatic, but created real pressure, as they forced the parties to make specific decisions about matters once taken for granted. Adjusting documents, if done, was not just an administrative act, but an official recognition that the previous identity did not fully reflect the truth, a symbolically powerful step for Robert. At the same time, legal questions related to the past, though not leading to specific prosecutions, still existed as issues needing resolution in terms of records and accountability, adding another layer of complexity to the post-reunion process. In that context, the adaptation process did not follow a linear path, but was experimental, where each side had to learn to interact in a new structure, without precedent. Robert had to rebuild the concept of family in a broader way, accepting that he could have multiple important connections at once without needing to prioritize one absolutely to prove loyalty. The biological family had to learn to see Robert not as the missing child in their memories, but as an adult with his own identity and boundaries, while the adoptive family had to adjust their role from the sole position to part of a larger picture. This adaptation process required time, psychological support, and the ability to accept that not all wounds could be fully healed, but they could still be lived with healthily. Difficult moments arose when expectations were unmet, when emotions were out of sync between parties, and when historical truth collided with current life reality. But those very moments also created opportunities to establish clearer boundaries and more realistic relationships. Post-reunion, therefore, was not a gentle conclusion to a long story, but a complex transitional phase, where the truth had been confirmed, but its meaning was still being learned and integrated into life by the parties. In this phase, Robert was no longer a passive victim or investigation subject, but became an active agent who had to redefine himself in a new context, where identity was no longer protected by lack of information, but had to be rebuilt based on truth. This process did not bring immediate liberation, but it opened the possibility for a different stability, not based on concealment or avoidance, but on accepting that the past, though unchangeable, could be integrated into the present in the least harmful way. Post-reunion, viewed from this angle, was a challenging but necessary phase, where the story did not end with finding each other, but continued with the effort to live with the truth in a redefined family structure and identity. From the turbulent post-reunion phase, where the truth about identity had been confirmed, but mental and legal life was still adapting, another layer of questions gradually became clearer, not revolving around who Robert was, but around what really happened in 1965, and why the case could go unresolved for decades. The unidentified perpetrator became the largest remaining gap in the story, as although the victim's identity had been clarified, no specific individual was officially identified as directly causing the initial separation. The remaining data was too fragmented to form a clear chain of responsibility, as potentially involved people were gone, witness memories had faded, and many key details were never recorded from the start. The failure to identify the perpetrator was not just an investigative failure, but a structural limitation of seeking truth after so many years, where time had blurred the line between intentional acts and the chaotic circumstances of an uncontrolled era. Alongside the question of the perpetrator was the unresolved issue of motive, as even assuming a kidnapping occurred, the purpose behind it remained hypothetical rather than conclusive. There was no strong enough evidence to determine whether the motive stemmed from a desire to take a child, an opportunistic decision, or a complex chain of circumstances involving social and personal relationships at the time. The fact that Robert was raised in an outwardly stable environment further blurred the line between criminal behavior and self-justifying narratives, making tracing the motive particularly difficult without direct testimonies or authentic documents. In that context, motive was not just a question about the reason for an act, but about how society at that time allowed such acts to occur undetected, an issue extending beyond a single case. Statute of limitations became the clearest legal barrier to any effort to pursue criminal accountability, as even imaginable reasonable scenarios could hardly be turned into specific legal actions. The law is designed to protect both victims' rights and fairness to suspects, and in this case, the passage of time had tipped the balance toward legal limits, where prosecution was no longer a realistic option, despite the desire for accountability. This created an emotionally difficult paradox, where truth could be confirmed, personally and socially, but not fully addressed within the current legal framework. For Robert and the involved families, statute of limitations was not just a legal concept, but an acknowledgement that a portion of traditional justice would never be achieved, forcing them to seek other forms of closure beyond court rulings. The question of possible similar cases was also raised seriously when looking back at the social context and management systems of the 1960s, as Robert's case could not be seen as entirely isolated in an era with many gaps in recording, tracking, and protecting children. The fact that a child could be taken and grow up under a different identity undetected for decades suggested that similar cases might have occurred and even remain unidentified today. This question was not meant to spread unfounded doubt, but to emphasize that Robert's case might be the tip of a larger systemic issue, where many missing person stories have never been reconnected to lives existing out there. In the context of increasingly common civil DNA and modern genealogy, the possibility of discovering more similar cases was no longer remote, and this case became a reminder that files once considered dead ends might still hold answers waiting to be activated by technology and individual initiative. The unresolved questions, therefore, existed not just as question marks about the past, but as warnings for the present, requiring the system to re-examine how missing person cases, especially involving children, are handled to prevent similar stories from repeating in different forms. For Robert, accepting that not all questions have answers was part of the post-reunion adaptation process, as the truth about identity brought many answers but also exposed insurmountable limits of investigation and law. The remaining gaps did not diminish the value of the confirmed truth, but they reminded that this story did not close with absolute completeness, but with an imperfect truth, sufficient to redefine the lives of those involved. In that space, the unidentified perpetrator, unclear motive, statute of limitations, and possibility of similar cases were not just unfinished items in a file, but open questions that society must continue to carry, as part of collective responsibility in understanding, remembering, and learning from its own limitations. From the lingering questions about the perpetrator, motive, and insurmountable legal limits, the case reached its official conclusion in the system in a file status that was both closed and transformative, where the core investigation goal had been achieved, though not in the complete way expected over more than half a century. The final status of the file was updated with the confirmation of the victim's identity, noting that Robert was not only alive but had lived a full life under a different identity, and the 1965 disappearance was no longer classified as unresolved. Closing the file did not mean every aspect of the case was resolved, but reflected the reality that the system had reached the maximum limit of what could be verified with existing evidence, while remaining questions could no longer be answered by traditional legal or investigative tools. The file was closed as a case with an identified victim and clarified survival status, a rare outcome for long-term missing person cases, most of which end in silence or tragic assumptions. For the field of cold case investigations, the significance of the case extended far beyond one individual or family, as it clearly illustrated that the concept of permanent deadlock was no longer absolute in the context of modern technology and methods. The case showed that once frozen files did not necessarily have to be resolved with the same tools that failed in the past, but could be reapproached from entirely different directions, where the focus was no longer on traditionally tracing criminal behavior, but on seeking identity and biological truth. This introduced a new understanding of cold case investigation goals, not just finding perpetrators but restoring names, histories, and truth to people deprived of their own stories. The role of DNA and genealogy in closing the case was recognized as decisive, not only for providing undeniable scientific evidence, but for allowing overcoming barriers erected by time, memory, and administrative records. DNA did not act as a miracle solving everything, but in this case it served as the key opening a door once considered permanently locked, enabling connection between a living person and a forgotten file. Modern genealogy, when combined with DNA data, proved that truth did not have to be found within one family or locality, but could be reconstructed through broader biological networks, surpassing boundaries that traditional investigations could not. The case thus became evidence of a shift from suspect-based to identity-based investigation, a change capable of reshaping how authorities approach missing person files in the future. The long-term impact of the case lay not only in closing a specific file but in how it changed perceptions in both the system and society about the existence of untold stories. For families with missing loved ones, the case sent a message that was both hopeful and realistic. Though time might diminish the ability to pursue accountability, it did not necessarily erase the possibility of finding truth. For investigative agencies, the case emphasized the importance of preserving files, maintaining reactivation potential, and being ready to integrate new tools when available, rather than viewing file closure as an absolute end. For Robert, the system's case closure did not mean the end of his personal journey, but it provided an important anchor, where the question "Who am I?" had an officially confirmed answer, allowing him to continue living with the truth without hanging in uncertainty. The case also set new standards for evaluating investigation success, as finding a living victim after more than half a century could be seen as a different form of justice, not punitive justice, but justice of recognition and acknowledgement. The final file status, therefore, was more symbolic than administrative, marking the transition from a story of loss to one of reconnection, though imperfect and unable to reverse what was lost. In a broader context, the case became a milestone showing how technology, when used responsibly and combined with individual persistence, could shake long-held assumptions about the impossibility of resolving old cases. Closing the case did not erase unanswered questions, but it established a foundational truth from which all other questions could be posed more honestly, no longer shrouded in identity uncertainty. This ending was not triumphant or celebratory, but one of acknowledgement, acknowledging that a person had been returned to his rightful place in his own history, that a family had answers after decades of waiting, and that the system, though slow and limited, still had the capacity to learn and evolve. In that state, the case was closed not as an absolute full stop, but as a milestone, where the past was confirmed, the present redefined, and the future of cold case investigations opened with a new awareness of what could be achieved when truth was pursued to the end, even if it took more than half a century to reach. The story of Robert Williams reminds people living in the United States today that safety often comes from systems and habits, not just from a feeling of peace. In 1965 in Phoenix, the entire community trusted others. The Williams family believed in the tranquility of their neighborhood, and the main witness only hesitated for a few minutes in front of a seemingly friendly stranger. That small gap, combined with the lack of technology, no cameras, no databases, no DNA, created a silent disappearance that lasted 54 years. The first practical lesson is risk management in seconds. When in public places, supermarkets, parks, parking lots, establish very specific American-style family rules. Who carries the child? Who stands in which position? Who is responsible for watching with strangers approaching children? Be polite but firmly maintain distance. Second, treat documents and personal data as life security. Robert grew up with incomplete newborn records and evaded questions. Only in adulthood did conflicting paperwork and medical's genetic history issues expose the cracks. Therefore, families should keep copies of birth certificates, medical records, photos, and identification information, updating them regularly, especially for young children. Third, if a family has doubts about origins or medical history, don't just accept and move on. Robert's case shows that consumer DNA testing and genealogy can open paths to verification, but it must come with psychological support, because reunion does not automatically heal. It brings identity crises and tension between biological and adoptive families. Finally, the community lesson: an early missing person report helps activate the system, and the system is only strong when citizens persistently report, store data, and responsibly utilize modern technology. If Robert Williams' story makes you think about cases that seemed long forgotten, and the power of truth uncovered after decades, please subscribe to the channel to join us on the next investigative journeys. Thank you for watching until the end of this story, and see you in the next video, where another old case may be reopened.